I'm Cynthia Cook, and I'm looking forward to getting us started today at the panel number 15, Implications of the National Defense Strategy for the Defense Acquisition System. I am a Senior Fellow and Director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I'm joined here today by three excellent panelists. My colleague Gregory Sanders is Fellow and Deputy Director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group at CSIS. Greg has spent the bulk of his professional career here, where he leads work looking at the implications of DoD spending using deep dives into available federal procurement data. We're also joined by David Arthur, who is an analyst in the Weapons System Division of the Congressional Budget Office. David has a very long resume of impactful analysis on a variety of weapon systems issues, and I'm really pleased that he's able to join us here today. Our last panelist is my former colleague until last week, Todd Harrison. He's the newly designated Senior Vice President and Director of Research at Meta Aerospace, which is not part of Facebook. Todd joined Meta from CSIS, where he led the aerospace program and the defense budget program. This is a budget presentation, but you should all know that, at the risk of embarrassing him, that Todd is a rock star in the aerospace community as well. So that's not exactly the order that's on the NPS website. So I wanted to share why I was switching up the order today. I'm basically taking the moderator's prerogative, and we're going to start with Greg talking about defense acquisition trends based on what the government has actually spent its procurement dollars on. David's talk will cover the challenges of adapting DoD's acquisition portfolio to a new defense strategy and how sticky it is. And finally, Todd will discuss the budget threat represented by inflation. And a couple of thoughts before we get started. As the Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisition and my immediate predecessor at CSIS, Andrew Hunter, shared yesterday, the NPS Acquisition Research Symposium has no parallel in the defense community. This is really the premier forum for understanding, discussing, and planning acquisition research and for exchanging ideas about acquisition. There's certainly other conferences that touch on acquisition, but this is one that, especially when it's in person, we all have the pleasure of being surrounded by other folks who know that while strategy is incredibly important, it can't be executed without careful attention to how and on what the government is spending its money. Even with the enormous budget that the US Department of Defense has, it does need to make choices among competing priorities, and those priorities also compete with a domestic agenda. A thoughtful spend is key to that. My second observation links to that, and that is on the importance of data. The analyses that you see here today rely on US government data, and having good data is key. Investments that DoD makes in collecting and maintaining acquisition data are critically important for providing transparency to the American people, for tracking priorities over time, and for a myriad of other performance management reasons. I don't know if Mark Crisco is in the audience today, but I really wanted to give him a shout out as DoD's Deputy Director of Enterprise Information, where he oversees a variety of data issues and always tries to do data right. I'd like to dedicate this panel to that effort and to the efforts of all the analysts on the panel and in the audience who collect, who process, who analyze defense data, and who use it to make sure that the government works to get best value from the dollars it spends. Greg, over to you.
Thank you, Cynthia. So as she mentioned, this presentation will reveal trends from contracting that include FY 2021, first year partially changed by the Biden administration. Contracting trends are valuable because they provide critical insights into DoD's priorities as expressed by spending and the industrial base's response to those priorities. I'd like to thank my co-author, Alexander Holderness, as well as my former colleague, Parmick, who had stewarded these trend presentations for years. So this report uses methodology common to other CSS reports on federal contracting. Based on federal procurement data system reporting, as well as legacy system reporting before the year 2000. Reporting has a few key limitations. It only covers prime contracts. Classified contracts are not required to be reported, and as a result, we assume they are largely absent. And especially in the back years, there are reporting limitations, which we almost exclusively do not attempt to correct. Nevertheless, FPS is a core administrative data used within the government, and is the basis for many forms of reporting requirements, and one of the best sources for seeing how the money flows out to the industrial base. As Todd will be discussing, inflation assumptions matter. I've updated this presentation to use the data as reported by the OMB from President's Budget 2023, converted. As Todd will cover, there are still some challenges there, but it's a replicatable base. So as was noted in forum last year, with a relatively flat defense budget, it would be difficult to maintain the fiscal year 2020 level of spending. And indeed, in fiscal year 21, defense contract spending was $38.65 billion, a fall of 10.6% from the half decade from fiscal year 20, and ending the half decade of growth from the low of fiscal year 15 that resulted from budget caps. Comparatively, the Defense Total Obligation Authority on the budget side decreased by just 4.8%, falling from about $750 billion to $709 billion. As we warned last year, defense contract spending often magnifies moves in the budget. However, even faster fall, spending nonetheless accounts for 54.5% of total Defense Obligation Authority, which is one of the higher levels in the last 3 decades. That proportion of rate of spending to industry is made possible in part by foreign military sales, which use the US acquisition system, but are not included in the budget figure. That said, obligations for contracts including FMS fell by a little over half in fiscal year 21, going from $52 billion in fiscal year 20 to $25 billion in fiscal year 21. And this dramatic shift happens in part because spending on major defense acquisition programs is often lumpy, with the F-35, which includes FMS, receiving multi-year funding in fiscal year 20 and dropping off greatly in fiscal year 21. So between fiscal year 15 and fiscal year 21, overall defense spending increased by 15% compared to 27% growth in contract obligations. So this was a growth spurt that was very much oriented towards the industrial base. So as I go deeper into these trends, I'm going to focus on 2 questions. How have purchasing priorities shifted, with a little bit of reference to the National Defense Strategy, or at least what we've seen of it? And second, how has the approach to the industrial base shifted, with some reference to the DoD State of Competition report from earlier this year? In both those reports came after fiscal year 21, but they can give some valuable context. So first, relevant to both the what and the how, we'll look at OTA spending and R&D. On the left, you can see the OTA spending had exponential growth through about fiscal year 20. And this spending is not included in the contracting figures. That ended in fiscal year 21, an 8% decline to now $15.4 billion. However, as the graph shows, fiscal year 21 includes a striking increase in ceilings for new and expanded OTA arrangements, suggesting the possibility of future growth. Crucially, the growth in fiscal year 20 and sustained spending in fiscal year 21 was driven in large part by Army support to a federal response to COVID-19. As Major General Holt and Jenna McKelvey from GAO covered a panel yesterday, OTA had a vital role in supporting Operation Warp Speed and other pandemic response efforts. And as we'll see in the next slide, traditional contracting system also played an important role starting in fiscal year 21. During the chart on the right, fiscal year 21 also had a surprising reversal. For the 5 years of the boom, OTA spending, that dark blue bar on top, grew faster than contract spending for R&D. But in fiscal year 21, defense contract spending was up 1%. This compared to a 9% drop for services, a 13% drop for products. However, collective R&D and OTA spending declined by 6% because of the fall in OTA. So as Mr. Hunter noted in his plenary remarks, transitions to fielded systems are still a major challenge. Phases of R&D spending that declined were later ones. System development and demonstration, 6.5, shown in the maroon, and operational system development, shown in the orange, fell by 28 and 41% respectively, year on year. On the other hand, OTA spending for products is growing, rising to 1.4 billion. That's a small portion of total OTA, but suggests that the acquisition spend system is becoming more comfortable using OTA fielding authority. So the most consistent trend looking at portfolios, which includes products, services, and R&D, is a decline. It suggests that the divest to invest trade-offs are primarily being made within portfolios rather than across them. So air and missile defense and aircrafts both whipsawed, showing the largest declines, 29% and 31% respectively, while other products in support of COVID-19 response, primarily implemented by the Army, increased by 104%. That's in the lower left corner, you can see that dramatic jump. The whipsaw effect is, again, multi-year contracts often. A large contract is not 1 year, the next year there's not as much money, but the overall amount going to the industrial base is relative. But one weapon system focused contract did grow, and that was space systems, which increased 18% to 8.7 billion, but still a comparatively small amount. And as we've been noting, unclassified space system has been slow growing despite the emphasis in the 2018 strategy. So this change has been a long time in coming and shows continuity regarding space as a priority. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have classified data in here, and there's a good deal going on in that category, or at least I would suspect so. So the Army and military health were the only components covered in this graph to grow last year, 7% and 1% respectively. And while the Army accounted for the large increase, again, it was the other products in support of COVID-19 rather than a sudden shift to Army as a priority. Navy took a double hit. All of the F-35 spending is counted under the Navy Joint Production Product Office, shown in gray. It fell from item nearly 37 billion to 10 billion. And shipbuilding obligations were also down, which contributed to the 13% fall in spending for the remainder of the Department of Navy. So we also took a deeper look at some emerging technology, remotely crewed vehicles. Remotely crewed vehicles are difficult to identify in FPDS because there's only one product or service code, 1550, unmanned aircraft. No separate codes for R&D, no codes for services, and no codes for land or maritime. So we used that code and manually identified remotely crewed MDAPs to create this chart. So we know that some of the spending, again, is taking place in classified realm. We've recently revealed Phoenix Ghost drones to Ukraine. But one thing that's striking is that while the Navy is making investments in remotely crewed maritime vehicles, we're seeing a fall in this data. So that 36% fall is contrary to what we expect from rising budgets. And that might suggest that we need better categories to be able to track that sort of spending. It's important to Navy priorities going forward. So the adaptable acquisition framework gets to the how of spending is done, and it prioritizes speed. And one aspect of that is the ability to quickly move on contracts. So procurement administrative lead time measures the length between a contract solicitation date and the date it's signed. Solicitation date was introduced to FPDS in the middle of fiscal year 2018 and gives us a chance to measure this. So for this presentation, I'm evaluating whether we've seen a decrease. And the short answer is no. The x-axis on this chart is the length of PALT, so procurement administrative lead time, on a logarithmic scale. The y-axis is the number of awards and task orders. Each of the 3 columns covers a fiscal year. Each of the 5 rows represents a bucket of contracts by size. So the smaller numerous contracts with ceilings below 15K are in the top row, and the larger contracts with ceilings over 13 million are in the bottom row. This first chart covers single award contracts. Many of these task orders are solicited and signed within a single day. You can see that on the chart on the left of each of the graphs. And those are tall bars, even down to 30 million. But judging by average or median PALT, contracts with ceiling above 1 million have taken longer to award. Possibly difficulties introduced by COVID or the difficult transition period might contribute to this. And the PPBE process is a crucial limiter on how fast the administration and workforce can accelerate things. Ultimately, the money needs to be there. So turning to all other contract types, there have been some improvements for contracts below 1 million. The median time for those between 100K and 1 million dropped from 45 days in 2019 to 36 days in fiscal year 21. However, again, for larger contracts, there were improvements from fiscal year 2019 to 2020, only to see a jump in contracting time in 21. So after excluding the single awards on the prior slide, contracts with ceiling over 30 million took a median number of days of 241 to go from solicitation to signing. But this all suggests that the acquisition system might be getting better at small awards. Seen innovation in Ciber, Air Force efforts at industry days where you bring in people and sign a single day. But the slowness on larger contracts is worth tracking. Smaller firms, innovative firms may not have the cash flow to wait 2/3 of the year for a larger opportunity. One classic example from my own experience was that satellite firms have cited that sometimes they'll have an opportunity to put something on a launch, and that opportunity window is not 240 days long, suffice to say. So it's an important area for future research, and I'd also credit the work of David Gill, who was previously presented on this topic in a previous NPS panel. So finally, looking at how contracting is done, competition did increase as an extent of contracting last year. And that happened despite the fact that a lot of the Army COVID-19 spending was not competitive. But the moves were relatively small, 41% to 42% of competition with multiple offers. And this was driven in part by composition effects. Products have the least competition, and products were dropping as a share of duty contracting across the last year. So the State of the Competition report highlighted new entrants, merger and acquisition policy, intellectual property approaches, including MOSA, modular open. But to move them, needle likely be necessary to spend up front on things like MOSA, or to consider greater integration of national heritage firms, to discuss in the defense supply chain report, but neglected in competition. So finally, we looked at a variety of different forms of commercial contracting, shown in green. We also included non-development or commercial items and services, which we discussed some in the 809 panel. And if your eyes are real good, you might be able to see that tiny blue line, but there's almost no funding there. So during the 5-year increase from fiscal year 2015 to fiscal year 2020, commercial contracting grew slightly slower than other forms, dropping from an 18% share to 17%. However, in fiscal year 21, commercial shot up to a 26% share, thanks again to that COVID-19 spending, rising to nearly 101 billion in fiscal year 21. So in closing, the bounce back after the drawdown and the budget caps has reached its end. And I think inflation guarantees that we're not going to see immediate growth of that style, even with an increase, in efforts to Ukraine and whatever happens in the next budget. R&D spending in space systems stood out as protected priorities, even as overall obligations declined. Acquisition agility is relatively difficult to measure with FPDS data, but as measured by PALD, it's not improving for large contracts. But response to COVID-19 showed how defense acquisition workers were able to respond rapidly to a national emergency using some of these tools like OTA, commercial source offerings, and general commercial contracting that were designed for that sort of purpose. So thank you, and I look forward to the other presentations.
Thanks, Greg. David?
Okay, let's see if I can call us up here. All right, my name's David Arthur. I'm with the Congressional Budget Office, and CBO is probably better known for its economic analyses and its scoring of legislation, things like, when the infrastructure bill was in progress, frequently waiting for a CBO score on the topic. But we also have a considerable part of the organization that does longer term policy analysis. And one of the things that we prepare annually is a 10 to 15 year projection of long range defense plans that the budget committees are interested in. They're concerned with allocating resources across the government and tend to want to look out farther than DoD's 5-year future years defense program. So as part of preparing that projection every year, we do a deep dive down into the various acquisition programs that DoD has in progress. And that's given us a chance to kind of observe over the last few years how things have evolved under the change in strategy from the counterinsurgency operations to the pivot to Asia. And so I'm going to just make a couple observations about the things we've seen. So I'm going to divide my comments up into two general pieces that we see as acquisition challenges as DoD attempts to generate a change in direction in its acquisition portfolio. And the first is funding. That's probably not a surprise to anyone. When you're in the process of changing what the military looks like, you go through a period of time where you need to invest in developing and procuring new things to fit the new strategy, while also maintaining readiness with the systems that are in the field right now. And most of my charts will be about that. But then there are also what I've called knowledge-based challenges here. Information also has to be developed to determine how the ship of acquisition is going to change direction. There's quite a bit of distance that has to be traveled from something simple like pivot to Asia to conclusions like the Marine Corps has made to give up tanks and replace them with land-based anti-ship missiles. So I'm going to start, because I work for the Congressional Budget Office, I'll start with the budget pieces. So the pie chart here shows the breakout of the president's budget request for 2023. The overall budget is about $6 trillion, or the proposed budget. About 2/3 of that, or around $4 trillion, is what's called mandatory spending. And that's not mandatory in the laws of physics sense, but it's mandatory denotes programs that Congress doesn't have to appropriate funds for every year. They're things like Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, where the projected amount of funding that's needed is based on formulas, how many retirees are there and what are the level of benefits. So that leaves about 1/3 of the overall budget, or in this case, it's 1.7 trillion for what are called discretionary programs. And those are the programs that you should think of when you're thinking of continuing resolutions and government shutdowns. So Congress has to appropriate these funds every year. And within discretionary, the Department of Defense makes up about half, and it's competing with non-discretionary spending. So it's things as varied from national parks to Department of Homeland Security. Within defense, acquisition, which we define as RDT&E, and procurement, makes up about roughly 1/3 of the budget. And within acquisition, there's, again, individual programs are competing. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the implications of these competitions. So one of the ways to potentially help funding constraints for acquisition would be to grow the entire pie. So again, the size of the pie, at least in the 2023 budget request, is about $6 trillion. But unfortunately, the administration's projections for revenues are only about 4.8 trillion. So though the projection is still for a considerable deficit this year. So the chart on the left shows annual deficits since 1971. And the chart on the right is the national debt, basically federal debt held by the public. So you can think of it as the accumulation of the annual deficits. And if you look, again, going back to the left-hand chart, you can see the two periods of large deficits in the recent past, the 2008 financial crisis and then the pandemic. These are, shocks to the system that have added considerably to the overall national debt over the last few years. And so looking out at the out years perspective for the total debt, things look fairly stable, but CBO doesn't try to make guesses or predictions of other shocks to the system that might occur. And unfortunately, it's a lot easier to imagine, I would say, bad things happening, things like the two shocks over the last 20 years, than potentially good things happening that could help improve that picture. So even within the defense budget, so even if DoD manages to get a larger piece of the pie, or if the pie grows, any increases in funding the DoD gets will probably have to be shared amongst other parts of the budget. Now this chart shows our latest projection based on the 2022 request, and it shows trends that we see year after year. A steady growth in operation and support in real terms. So these charts are in constant dollars. That largely occurs because large fractions of the operation and support budget simply grow at rates faster than inflation. In particular, healthcare costs, military healthcare costs, and pay and benefits for civilian and military employees of DoD, and then buried within operation and maintenance are increases for contractors and things like that. And another potential issue that suggests pressure on acquisition is the sharp increase that we typically see in acquisition projected beyond DoD's 5-year plan. You can see on the blue acquisition line that increase that's occurring out past the end of the FIDIC. And the next chart I have zeroes in on that in a little bit more detail. Again, this is from the last projection that we did. And you can see the Navy shows the sharpest increase. That's mostly due to the shipbuilding program. There's Columbia-class submarines and new frigates come in. But you can also see it for the other services as well. The Air Force will have a new ICBM, and the new bomber production will begin. And the Army has an ambitious program now where they're essentially trying to modernize most of the portions of their major equipment, in particular the future vertical lift. And what this doesn't reflect is historical cost curves. So these curves are based on DoD's estimates at the time this budget was prepared. And we've seen historically that the cost of programs tend to grow. So the picture may actually be a bit worse than the one shown here. So enough gloom and doom about the budget. One thing that we've also observed over the last bunch of years is sort of what I'm calling the knowledge-based challenges to changing the acquisition portfolio. I remember when the pivot to Asia was first making a splash about 10 years ago. We were all excited. We descended upon the first budget that was released after that, and we're shocked to see that we were going to still have an army. Why would we have an army if we're pivoting to Asia? And where's the bomber procurement? We're still buying fighters. That doesn't make any sense. That's not going to apply to the conflict with China. But the fact is, again, it takes a lot of work to translate a high-level policy change of the sort that you see in the national security strategy into the nuts and bolts of a detailed program. There's a lot of study and experimentation is required. We're seeing that now with what the Marines are trying to do. The General Berger and his Marine Corps 2030 plan, it shows some of the more dramatic adaptations to a pivot to Asia. Continues to be a work in progress. They're getting pushback from former commandants and some of the Marine Corps development folks have asked for more time. Sometimes even simple habits of thoughts that can be developed over an extended period of time with an old strategy need to be overcome. Just for example, thinking about attacking targets. We've been almost 30 years now of a focus on a regional contingency where pretty much to some extent, no targets were off limits. We might worry about how heavily defended a target is. Do we need a standoff weapon or a stealth aircraft to attack it? But if we could attack it, that was fine. Now in the area of thinking about conflicts with nuclear armed adversaries, we have to start thinking about the target set differently. Do we really want to attack a target, or could that cause more problems than be useful? And what implication does that have for the mix of weapons and the type of things we purchase? Another thing is DoD, we have to go through the process of determining which systems already fit and which ones we should get rid of. And as we see year after year, that's a fraught process also with systems like the A-10 and the Navy's cruisers that the services would like to divest, but the Congress has different ideas. And it makes me think back to the QDR in 2001, where the name of the game was to be transformational. And systems and system constituencies are good at trying to fit into what's required at the time. It was amazing the number of old systems that were suddenly transformational for some reason or another. And then finally, once you decide what new weapons you need, it simply takes time to develop them. So there can be an extended period of time of RDT&E. And I'll get off the stage with the last chart that kind of illustrates that. So this chart looks at the relationship between procurement and RDT&E since 1980. And each line is the fraction of overall acquisition. So periods where the blue line and the black line are far apart are periods where procurement is relatively high and RDT&E relatively low. So you see that in the 1980s for the Reagan buildup, where it was all hands on deck to build things. I mean, things like the C5 restart, where we simply fired up a production line that had been closed for 15 years to build more airplanes. Things like that were going on. So fast forwarding to the present day, we're in another one of those bottlenecks where a lot of effort is being put into the RDT&E. But our projections show that, at least as current plans are laid out and pieced together, that aperture should start broadening out again, assuming the plans continue as they are currently laid out. I mean, we're not trying to make predictions here. This is simply a projection of the plans as they were laid out in the last FIDIC that we announced. And that was all I had, Cynthia.
Thanks, David. That was really interesting. Our last speaker, Todd Harrison, is bringing a more worrisome message. He'll be talking about inflation, which is on the top of a lot of folks' minds these days. Todd?
Hi, thanks, Cynthia. And really great, thoughtful presentations by both Greg and David. So it's a hard act to follow. And you're right, I'm going to bring a more dismal tone to the conversation. because, for years, as we've been talking about defense acquisition programs and the budget and availability of funding, a lot of the focus has been on, the Budget Control Act over the past decade and the uncertainty that was driving, the shift in focus in the defense strategy, and is that ever actually going to materialize itself in a shift in what we're buying and what we're investing in. But now we've got something new to be concerned about, and it's something, if you look back at the history of inflation, it's something we haven't experienced in 40 years. So inflation is really, at a level we haven't seen since the early 1980s. And so for almost all of us, that's our entire professional lives, we have not had to deal with inflation at this level. So I'm going to put up some slides here. And what inflation is doing is it is changing how we have to do our analysis on the back end. And longer term, it is going to start to change our buying power within the Department of Defense. So, I mean, it's already starting to, but we're going to see those effects accumulate over time. So I wanted to go through and just, put some data up here, food for thought. So this chart, I went back and looked up the different inflation assumptions from different budget requests and comparing it to current estimates. Now, one thing that should be noted up front, there are a lot of different ways to measure inflation. The one you'll probably hear about on the news the most is the Consumer Price Index for urban workers, CPIU. The CPIU measures the inflation that we as individuals feel for the types of items that an individual tends to buy. But that's not always appropriate for defense, because what defense and what heavy industry tends to buy is a different mix of goods, right? And so what we use for defense and for other parts of the federal government is the GDP Chained Price Index. That is an overall measure of inflation in the U.S. economy. Now, should be noted that the CPIU and the GDP Chained Price Index over time do tend to trend with one another. So when you see the CPI go up, you almost always see the GDP Chained Price Index go up as well. The CPIU numbers get published monthly. The GDP Chained Price Index numbers get published quarterly with monthly updates. So, we don't get numbers quite as quickly for the GDP deflator, but, the data is coming and it is regularly updated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. The other thing that should be noted is inflation is not something you can go out and just read a meter and measure it directly. It's something you have to approximate. They do that by large surveys. There are many different tools that are used to come up with inflation measures. That's just how we look at what inflation is happening right now and what has happened in the past. So we have pretty good indications for what is actually happening, what's happened in the past. When you're looking at future inflation, it is an assumption. You can base that assumption off historical trends and all sorts of analysis that you can do. But the bottom line is you're trying to predict the future, and it's always unpredictable. So case in point, if you go back and look at inflation estimates that were in previous budget requests, historically, we have seen inflation average the GDP Chain Price Index, which is what we're dealing with here. It averages around 2.1% annually. That is normal historical inflation. And typically in a budget request, that's what you see. It might be a little lower, a little higher for the first couple of years of the request, but the long-term projection almost always is right around 2 to 2.2%. That's normal. And honestly, as a budget analyst, we often just take that for granted, right? Because, rule of thumb, that is close enough. That's almost always going to be close enough for projecting future inflation, except when it's not. And we're in one of those periods now where it's not. So the green columns that you see here, those were the inflation assumptions that were in the PB21 budget request that was released in the spring of 2020. Right. So the spring of 2020, that's what they were estimating. Perfectly good estimate at that time. Nothing shocking from that at that time. The yellow columns are what was in last year's budget submission, the PB22 request. That's where, for FY20, as of last year, they had better information for FY20 and they adjusted it down. So FY20 inflation ended up being a little lower than they had thought the year before. PB23 is the budget request that just now came out. And so you can see the assumptions that they put in there. And as we all know, the inflation environment has dramatically changed. Now, if you read the budget justification, it says that they made these assumptions in November of last year. So really, this just reflects their best thinking as of November. Why did they make the assumption then? Well, there's all sorts of ripple effects in the budget, not just for defense, but for non-defense as well. Where you have to adjust things based on what inflation assumptions that you're using. So they snapped the line in November, and this is what they thought it would be. So as of November, they were predicting inflation for fiscal year 21 would be 3.1%. And they estimated for FY22, which had just started at that time, they estimated inflation would go up to about 3.9%. And then for FY23, they thought inflation would return almost to normal, 2.2%. And then they just made a blanket 2% assumption beyond that. The problem is that since November, we have gotten more and more data, and we have learned that inflation was actually worse than we thought in FY21, and it is definitely worse than we thought it would be in FY22 so far. We're only halfway through the fiscal year. Who knows if it will get even worse or if it will start to subside and get better by the end of the year. That's something to watch closely. So the orange column is the latest estimates that were published as of April 28th by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So you can see FY20, looking that far back, it didn't really change. We have a good idea what inflation was then. FY21, very different. So it turns out in FY21, inflation was actually running about 4.6%. For FY22, the year's not over yet. So I looked at the first quarter, the most recent quarter, that is January to March of this year, and I annualized that rate. It was running at an annualized rate the first quarter of this year of 8%. That's in the GDP chain price index. The CPI, consumer price index, is actually higher than that. It's been running 8.5, 8.3% if you look at it month by month. So inflation is running a lot higher in fiscal year 22 than anticipated. If it continues at this rate, it'll end up being 8% for the year. It may go up, it may go down from that. I think it is highly unlikely it will go down enough that by the end of the year, it ends up being 3.9%. So FY22 inflation assumptions are also highly likely to be too low. They are off. So what about FY23? Now we're totally predicting the future here. How is this wave of inflation going to run its course? Economists are debating this furiously. Part of it depends on things like what's going on with Ukraine and Russia and the energy supply. Part of it depends on supply chain disruptions, which depends on COVID case rates in China and Chinese policy for locking down cities and certain ports. There are all sorts of factors beyond our control. And of course, the Federal Reserve trying to fight inflation by raising interest rates. Are they going to drive us into a recession? But if they overdo it, or do they underdo it? Inflation continues. A lot of things going on here. Very difficult to predict. I think it is safe to say, though, it is unlikely that inflation will return to normal in FY23. How much higher will it be? Anyone's guess, right? And then, of course, how long does it take to fully come down and get back to historical inflation? So what I did, for the sake of argument here, is I made some assumptions. So those are the white bars with the orange outline. I assume for FY23, let's say inflation does start to come back down. It ends up being about 6% for the year. And in FY24, it continues to decline. It comes down to 3%. And then beyond that, it turns to the historical average of 2.1%. All right. So I think that's a fairly reasonable assumption based on the data that we have as of right now. This could be wildly off, but for the sake of assumption, let's go with that. So those are my assumptions: 8% for FY22, what we're currently running at, then goes to 6% next year, then 3%, and then back to the historical normal level in 25 and beyond. Now, if you do that, here's what that does to DoD's buying power. So the blue line, I actually had to go back and I adjusted everything to FY20 because that's the last year for which we have accurate numbers for inflation. So I went back and adjusted everything to FY20. The blue line is a projection of the DoD top line budget. So this is the DoD discretionary budget over the FYDP. As submitted in PB23, adjusting for inflation using the PB23 inflation assumptions. The orange line is if you use the higher level of inflation that I showed on the last chart. So my assumptions for future inflation. Now, important thing to note, because FY21 ended up being higher than assumed, the lines start to depart in FY21. The lines depart even more in FY22 because, we are seeing inflation run at a higher rate already. They depart even more in FY23. They start getting closer in 24, and then 25 and 27, the lines actually run in parallel. So the more you are off in your inflation assumptions early on, the more that has a ripple effect going forward. If you just look at what this would do to DoD's buying power, from FY23 to FY27, that's a reduction in buying power of a little more than $330 billion. And that's in FY20 dollars. If you put it in then-year dollars, it would be even more. So we're looking at, more than a $330 billion reduction in buying power over the coming years. That is a significant impact to DoD. That is not something DoD can just absorb. That is something that the money has to come from somewhere. Either they have to get top line relief from Congress, which I think, at least for this year seems very likely, or they have to start, making trade-offs within the budget, cutting, force structure, scaling back or delaying modernization programs, cutting end strength. You could try to do efficiencies, tried that many times, not going to get that much savings out of efficiencies, but folks will always push to try that, but it will force a number of painful decisions in the coming years. And so I think, that's why it's incumbent on defense officials to start getting realistic about inflation and recognizing, the PB23 inflation assumptions, they're set by OMB. They were set back in November. We have to, own up to the fact they're not likely to come true. Inflation's running much higher. We need to be prepared for that. As a defense community. And so where we're going to start to see this really manifest itself are in a few areas. One is in direct labor cost. So about half of DoD's budget actually goes to paying military personnel their benefits and to paying DoD civilian personnel, right? And so we are seeing those costs already start to come up. The pay raise is typically set by the employment cost index. The employment cost index is generally lagging inflation. If you look at it over time, it tends to lag behind. Once workers start feeling inflation in their own personal lives, they start demanding more in terms of wages from their employers, and then you see that private sector pay starting to go up. The employment cost index that went into this budget request was a 4.6%, right? So we're already planning in PB23 a 4.6% pay raise for military and civilian personnel. I just went and looked yesterday at the latest figures on the employment cost index. Already this year, it's running at about 5%. It may go up even more by the end of this year. So we should be planning, there will at least be another 5% pay increase in PB24, could be higher, just to keep up with private sector wages. The other way DoD is going to start to see it is as contracts come up either for renegotiation or new contracts, or even some existing contracts have to come back and ask for economic adjustments, right? So if you had a contract and you had built into it an assumption of like 2 or 3% inflation, you're realizing that's not accurate. And you can come back and ask for adjustments to that. New contracts for sure are going to build in these higher inflation assumptions for the future, and also higher labor costs that the defense industry is already starting to feel right now, and what they're going to feel in the future. A compounding factor on labor costs is we're in a really tight labor market. It may not seem like it, but the last figures I heard reported were that there are 1.8 times as many job openings as there are workers looking for a job. So many more job openings than there are workers that are out there looking for jobs. Unemployment is already back down to almost the level it was before the pandemic started, which is a historically low level. We're at 3.6% unemployment right now. It is hard to get much lower unemployment than that in our economy. And so you've got a lot of competition for job openings and not that many workers that are out looking for jobs. So, we're going to see, wage pressure grow and grow. That's going to affect the defense industry and the competition for talent. And that is ultimately going to affect the cost of acquisition programs going forward. So I'll pause there and hand it back over to you, Cynthia, and we can get to the Q&A.
Thanks, Todd. We actually had one question, which is a clarification. Is there any kind of industry specific inflation index, like heavy industry or aerospace?
If you go and look at the different measures of inflation, you can subdivide it by different sectors of the economy. I'm not aware of a BEA publication that is specific to defense, but you can narrow it down to heavy industry. You can certainly exclude things like energy and food, right? And just look at core inflation. There are a lot of different ways to dice it. Now, DoD separately comes out with its own inflation measures, defense deflators that are specific to different parts of the budget. So in the Green Book, whenever that gets published, it will have DoD deflators for procurement, for RDT&E, et cetera. But keep in mind, the Green Book, once it gets published, it will all be based on these lower assumptions about the GDP chain price index.
Okay, thanks. So that's sort of a sobering note on which to close the impact of inflation on defense budgets. Again, we have a nice audience. If you have particular questions, please put them in the Q&A tab. But I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and start off with the first question, which is really, I'd like to tee this up to all three of the panelists in the order in which you spoke today. How do you see this research overlapping? Can you take reflections on each other's presentations and sort of talk about how it connects with your work? Greg?
Get a lot more closely for FPS and acquisition is going to be pricing mechanism. Firm fixed price contracts that you made in a low inflation environment are suddenly going to be a rubber bad deal for industry. The incorporating fixed price with economic price adjustments is already going to become more common, because that lets the government take on the inflation risk rather than potentially have pay industry a premium to do so. And I think when contracts end, as Todd mentioned, just being interesting to watch. One thing that I really found fascinating was the chart from David regarding the procurement and R&D. We've done some look at ratio of procurement spend to R&D, but it's really striking in 21. And I think the contract data, with R&D being the one set to not go down, shows the same result. And I think it'll be fascinating to see whether we have a successful transition to greater procurement, which is baked into current plans, but I think has been a consistent difficulty. And as the middle tier of acquisition reaches that 5-year limit, as they're starting to reach the end of their current programs, it's going to be important to see, does that actually happen? Does the bottleneck open up again? Or are we going to be in this tighter space for a while? And I think that's two very different acquisition environments.
Thanks. David?
Yeah, so certainly Greg's work kind of highlighting potential bottlenecks that are downstream of kind of the inputs that I work on. I mean, that's important because, you know, that's friction in the system. And I think I briefly mentioned that a lot of these acquisition programs typically show cost growth over the course of their lifetime. And I didn't show any charts in this presentation, but we actually do kind of a parallel projection where we look at historical cost growth and try to apply that to the portfolio. And I think, you know, uncertainties in buy rates, all that sort of, you know, slowness getting things on contract contributes to what to us is kind of an after the fact black box, but definitely relates to the cost growth. And then inflation, I mean, yeah, that's certainly a problem. Like Todd said, it's always been the simple 2%, you know, at least for as long as I've been worried about constant dollars versus nominal dollars. But it's going to become an issue. And we've actually already seen that with the, I'm trying to get the dates right here. So the 2021 request, which came out in early 2020, we started our analysis on that with, again, you know, inflation estimates that were contemporary, and then the pandemic hit. And so, you know, the GDP growth was changing dramatically and everything was moving around, and it caused curves to look really weird and things to cross over where they'd never crossed over before. And it took a lot of consultation with the economists that are on CBO's staff to try and figure out how to deal with that. And leading into the work that we're starting now in the 2023 budget, we're definitely going to be working much more closely with them to try and figure out how to handle our adjustment. I mean, we adjust everything to constant dollars, but that's kind of a cop-out. It's not in an uncertain environment. Got to be more careful than just getting a stream of deflators and slapping it on as a multiplier. So it's definitely on our radar screen as well.
Yeah, and, you know, one thing I would add, you know, picking up on what David said, I think at this point, we probably need to start doing our analysis in then year dollars for the time being until we get a little more certainty around inflation, because you're right. If you're just slapping on a deflator assumption, it kind of hides that uncertainty from folks, or show two different curves like I did before. But yeah, it really throws a kink in a lot of our normal analysis and processes as budget analysts. The other thing I would point out is, you know, like I said before, I think Congress is very likely to add money to this budget request. I mean, if I was going to guess, I'd say they probably add 40 or 50 billion to the PB23 request when all is said and done. But the big question is, how are they going to add that money? Because, you know, it's not as if appropriators are just going to say, oh, here's some extra money to count for inflation. That's not how they appropriate. They appropriate specific dollar amounts in specific accounts for specific purposes, right? And as Deputy Secretary Kath Hicks said, you know, just recently, you know, that they don't, you know, if Congress wants to add money to adjust for inflation, they would welcome that. They don't want Congress to use that as an excuse to put back funding for things, for platforms that the department was trying to divest, right? So it's a very good point that she raises. If they add 40 or 50 billion to the budget, but they use a lot of that to put things back in the program, that doesn't help at all to adjust for inflation. In fact, it kind of exacerbates the problem. So really, you know, if Congress wants to adjust for inflation, they've got to be specific. They've got to know where the money is needed and the quantities. That's where it actually comes back on DOD. DOD has to come back and actually show them and give them the data and say, look, this is where we think we're going to experience higher inflation. And this is our estimate for how much more funding that would require, you know, literally on an account by account basis, so that Congress has some basis to add the money back if they really want to be adjusting for the effects of inflation. Otherwise, if Congress doesn't have that data, if they don't have an estimate like that, they can either try to estimate it themselves. Hopefully they go to CBO, or, they're going to end up putting the money towards things that just add more into the program rather than giving DoD the money it needs to accommodate price growth within the program.
Yeah, that's a good point, Todd. DoD has to be careful what they wish for, because they might wish for money, but if it's to keep old systems in the inventory that are just going to cost a lot to maintain and use, then maybe they don't want that extra money. So I want to sort of follow up on that. And one of our audiences, Admiral Lewis, asks a question that I think ties to where I wanted to go next, which is he asks, in one of yesterday's panels, a participant noted that commercial company profits and cash accounts are at record highs, suggesting that inflation in some cases might be masking cost recovery from losses in 2020 through 2021 due to COVID. Wages have gone up 6.3%. It was the last number he had seen, but not as fast as inflation. Do you all have thoughts on that? And in particular, if the impact of COVID, is this always going to be an asterisk when we look backwards at defense spending, or is this just part of normal trends? Because we've seen inflation in the past, and there's certainly been pandemics in the past, but nothing really that's had the impact that COVID-19 has had. So if you could reflect on that, I'd appreciate it. Any volunteers for Dave? I noticed that you're not on mute, so maybe you'd like to start us off.
I can volunteer by chickening out.
Okay.
I'm an engineer by education, not an economist, and I took an economics class as an undergrad, but to the extent that the inflation is transient, that would certainly help weather it help DoD weather the period beyond just the fact that the absolute amounts would be lower. For example, you can ask the civilians and the service members to take one for the team for a year or two with raises that are below inflation. That I don't know if that happened for mill pay, but it certainly did with civ pay shortly after the financial crisis, as my checkbook showed. But again, that's like releasing oil from the strategic reserve. You can only go to that well once or twice before people start voting with their feet, and retention and recruitment becomes a problem.
Yeah, I would jump in here a bit, and like David, I should offer caution. I'm not an economist. I'm also an engineer by training, and I also took one economics class in undergrad.
Exactly.
But if you do go back and look at the trends, one point I would make is that wage growth lags behind inflation. So it will come, but there will be a delay of a year or so between when you see inflation spike and when you see wage growth spike. And go back and look at the data from the late 70s and early 1980s, and you will see that. The other thing I would notice when, and I don't know if I haven't looked at the data, about commercial companies holding on to more cash, but I can tell you when companies hold on to cash, it usually means that they're uncertain about the future, that they're hedging, that they're afraid that a downturn might be coming and they might need that cash. Generally, they don't want to hold on to cash. They want to deploy that cash. They want to invest it either in their business or, give it back to shareholders or invest it elsewhere. So, if they're holding on the cash, that usually means they're worried about something, that something is coming. They might see something, trends that are disturbing to them. So that is a cautionary note in and of itself.
Greg, you want to jump in?
Sure. So, I think that ultimately, whatever process DoD comes up with for inflation adjustments, there's a fair amount of information to have coming in from cost-based contracts or other areas to actually look at some of what the justification might be for these potential increases. But I think even if we add the asterisk for COVID-19, we might be moving into a new environment preceded COVID of lower unemployment and ultimately having not as much smack in the economy that can be easily picked up by DoD. So that forces harder trade-offs, and ultimately, if you want to sustain a higher level of spending for duty purposes, you might have to look at things like tax increases that can put a counter-inflationary pressure, but put money towards that. And even without the COVID-19 inflationary pressure, I think if your environment with consistent no unemployment, trade-offs are just going to be harder. It's good for a country, but sometimes challenging for defense enterprise.
Cynthia, if I could jump in with one other thought. Inflation affects different industries and different companies in very different ways, right? And especially if you're thinking about the cost of employees, the cost of labor, a bigger factor than inflation in itself is, the supply and demand of particularly skilled labor in different areas, right? And so that could drive your wage costs much higher for one type of skilled labor than another type. The other thing to keep in mind is different companies have different debt levels, and their debt, it depends on the terms of that debt, but inflation may actually be good in some cases if you've got a high debt load that's at a fixed rate for a long term. You can essentially inflate your way out of part of that debt. It can be very bad if you've got debt that's maturing and you've got to refinance right now because inflation and interest rates have gone way up. So, it really can affect different businesses, even if they're in the same industry, in very different ways, just depending on their financial position.
Absolutely. And I recall that argument at the last time there was high inflation that, we're inflating our way out of our national debt. We have another question on inflation, but before I get there, I'd like to take a sort of an easy poll. So back to COVID-19. I'll note the three of you are notably productive researchers, and both, all three of you have extensive publication records. Can you just raise your hand if your last few reports mentioned COVID-19? No from Todd. Greg? Okay, so yes from David and yes from Greg. So 2 out of 3 of the analysts have at least reflected on the impact of COVID-19 in their recent published work. So we'll see if it is an asterisk or if these last 2 years are sort of a more notable piece of history. Todd, I think all your aerospace work, I don't know if the virus can survive in the Leo layer, so I guess you get a pass on that.
Yeah, the last report was our space threat assessment, and COVID is not a space threat. So
okay, excellent. All right, so we have another question on inflation, and it is from Laura Huber. Apologies if I've mispronounced your last name. But she asks if there is data from when inflation was this high in the past to help better predict the future. And I think I might be one of the few people here who was impacted by the gas lines of the 1970s. So I remember the last time there was high inflation. Although I would note that my impact was sitting in long lines in the back seat of our 1970s station wagon rather than as a driver at the time. But it still does stick in my memory. So can you all talk about your, if you have it, research from the past? How can we use that to better understand where we are today?
yeah, I was, without revealing my exact age, I was alive but too young to remember inflation in the late 70s and the early 80s. So all of my perspective is just looking back at the historical data. And that's the time period you want to look at, right? That's the last time we saw inflation this high. But there are a lot of important caveats of why we're in a slightly different situation now, right? It's what was driving inflation back then, how policymakers responded. is not necessarily instructive for the type of inflation we're experiencing now. And, as David pointed out, we aren't even sure yet exactly, what type of inflation we're experiencing. Is it transient? I mean, that's what the Federal Reserve Chair was saying a year ago. But Jay Powell's not saying transient much more at this point. How much of it is caused by supply chain disruptions that were related to COVID? How much of it is now being driven by spikes in energy prices because of the conflict in Ukraine? How much of it is driven by a tight labor market? I mean, economists will fight over this and sort it out later when we're looking back on this period. But if you want historical analogy, I think the most recent period to look at is late 70s, early 80s.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true for the overall economy. I often try to go back and try to find a typical period of, in particular defense spending, and quickly learn that there's no such thing as typical. It's like every era has got its own unique thing going on that can potentially muddy any effort to define some long-term normal. And thinking back to the 70s, late 70s, I mean, DoD at that point, I think I have my timing right, was transitioning to the all-volunteer force. So the economics of manpower costs were very, very different back then, which could, call into question the applicability of how DoD responded at that time. But again, that was before my time, so I don't remember any of the means that were taken at that point. And in fact, a large reason why a lot of our charts stop at 1980 is to, just sort of lop off a lot of the uncertainty that the inflation of the 70s brought about.
Well, I think that might be an interesting research paper for one of the NPS students to compare this era of inflation with the past, although it might take a couple of years before there's enough data now. So let's move away from inflation, about which I know we're all worried, onto a new, possibly worrisome topic. David, your briefing showed that the ratio of RDT&E to procurement is at a high, but this is quickly changing going forward with rapid growth in procurement. Can you unpack that trend and its implications? And you might not be able to address this, but this could raise a concern that the DoD isn't investing enough in its seed corn for innovation, and instead is going to be building systems rather than looking to the future.
Let me just come on, guys. We have one more minute before the panel ends. So
okay.
Answer.
Okay. Well, basically, RDT&E is still, it's historically very high right now, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but even over the course of our 10-year projection, although RDT&E declines a fair amount, and that's why you see that widening of the lines again, it remains at quite high levels. So I think a lot of what we're seeing now is a lot of systems are in the EMD phase, and at least the plans are to field them within the next 5 to 10 years. And so I think a large part of the drop off in the RDT&E is just those things wrapping up. And then another thing that kind of goes on, I think, inside the FITIP is that we tend to see, as the FITIP goes on, just even in normal years, again, right after saying there's no such thing as normal, RDT&E tends to tail off toward the end. And I think a little bit of what's going on there is it's easy to, you don't garner much attention if you slice off a little bit of RDT&E out of a bunch of programs. But if in the out years of your FITIP, you're showing a drop in the numbers of weapon systems that are being purchased, that attracts a lot of attention. And so I think there's a kind of a bias in the FITIP bill to let the RDT&E slip a bit, even though we find that looking at how FIDPs in the past have performed over time. FIDPs tend to underestimate RDT&E that ultimately gets spent.
Okay, thanks. That's a great answer and a great explanation. Michelle has alerted us we're at time, so I want a round of virtual applause for the panelists today. This was a great session. I feel like I'm smarter now than I was an hour and a half ago, and thank you very much for participating today, and thanks to NPS for hosting such a terrific event.